Welcome back to another journey through history together. If you're settling in for the night, finding that comfortable position in your bed, and ready to let your mind wander through the corridors of the past, then you're exactly where you need to be. I'm so glad you've chosen to spend this evening with me, exploring one of the most pivotal moments of the Cold War. Tonight, we're traveling back to the early 1960s, to a time when the world seemed balanced on the edge of a knife. We'll walk through the story of the Bay of Pigs invasion, a tale that begins with revolutionary fervor in Cuba and ends with the superpowers of the world staring into the abyss of nuclear conflict. This isn't just a story about a failed military operation. It's about the delicate dance of diplomacy, the weight of presidential decisions, and how a single miscalculation in the Caribbean nearly changed the course of human history. As we explore this together, let your breathing slow and your mind focus on the voices and personalities that shaped these events. There's something deeply human about this story, the way fear and hope intertwined, how leaders grappled with impossible choices, and how the fate of millions hung in the balance of conversations held in rooms most of us will never see. So get comfortable, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's begin our journey to April 1961, when the world held its breath and waited to see if peace would prevail. Chapter 1: Cold War Tensions and Castro's Rise. To understand the Bay of Pigs, we must first understand the world in which it occurred. The year is 1959, and the Cold War has settled into the global consciousness like a persistent winter fog. Two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, eye each other across an ideological divide that seems unbridgeable. Nuclear weapons have transformed warfare from a question of who can fight longest to who can destroy fastest. In this tense atmosphere, a bearded revolutionary named Fidel Castro has just overthrown the Cuban government of Fulgencio Batista. The Cuban Revolution had been swift and decisive. Castro's 26th of July movement, along with other revolutionary groups, had swept across Cuba with surprising speed. By January 1959, Batista fled the country and Castro marched triumphantly into Havana. Initially, the United States watched with cautious interest. Castro was not yet the communist leader he would become. His early statements spoke of democracy and reform, not of Marxist revolution. American officials thought they might be able to work with this charismatic new leader who had promised to clean up Cuba's corruption and restore democratic governance. But Castro's Cuba was a complex place. The island nation, just 90 miles from the Florida coast, had been essentially an American economic colony for decades. American companies owned vast sugar plantations, mining operations, and utilities. The infamous American Mafia had turned Havana into a playground for wealthy Americans seeking gambling, entertainment, and activities that might be frowned upon back home. Castro's revolutionary government began making moves that worried Washington. Land reforms affected American-owned properties. Executions of Batista supporters, while popular among many Cubans who had suffered under the previous regime, concerned American officials about the rule of law. Most troubling of all, Castro began developing closer ties with the Soviet Union. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. In February 1960, Soviet Deputy Premier Anastas Mikoyan visited Cuba and signed a trade agreement. Cuba would sell sugar to the Soviet Union and in return receive oil, machinery, and technical assistance. This was not just an economic arrangement, it was a geopolitical realignment that sent shockwaves through Washington. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a man who had spent his career understanding the strategic importance of positioning and alliances, saw the Cuban situation as potentially catastrophic. Here was a communist regime establishing itself in America's backyard, potentially providing the Soviet Union with a military foothold just minutes away from American shores. The Central Intelligence Agency, under the leadership of Alan Dulles, had been monitoring the situation closely. Dulles was a veteran of intelligence operations, having served with distinction during World War II. He understood the value of covert operations and the importance of preventing communist expansion wherever possible. By 1960, the CIA had begun developing what would become known as the Bay of Pigs plan. The concept was elegantly simple in theory. Train a force of Cuban exiles to invade their homeland, overthrow Castro, and establish a government friendly to the United States. The model was Guatemala, where in 1954 the CIA had successfully orchestrated the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz, who had threatened United Fruit Company's interests and was deemed too friendly to communist influences. The Guatemala operation had been swift and successful. A small force of exiles, supported by CIA training and equipment, had managed to destabilize the Arbenz government. The international community had barely noticed, and the new government was much more amenable to American interests. Cuba, however, was not Guatemala. Castro's government had genuine popular support among many Cubans, particularly the rural poor, who had benefited from land reforms and literacy programs. Castro himself was a much more formidable opponent than Arbenz had been. A charismatic leader with a talent for survival and an increasingly sophisticated understanding of international politics. Nevertheless, by the time Eisenhower left office, the CIA had made significant progress in developing the operation. Training camps had been established in Guatemala, where Cuban exiles were learning the arts of guerrilla warfare and amphibious assault. Weapons were being stockpiled and plans were being refined. The exiles themselves were a diverse group. Some were former Batista supporters who had fled Cuba when Castro took power. Others were Democrats who had initially supported Castro, but became disillusioned as his government moved toward authoritarianism and Marxism. Many were simply Cubans who loved their homeland and wanted to return to a Cuba free from what they saw as tyranny. These men trained in the Guatemalan mountains with a mixture of hope and desperation. They believed they were fighting for their country's freedom, and they trusted that the United States would provide them with the support necessary to succeed. This trust would prove to be one of the most tragic elements of the entire operation. As 1960 drew to a close, the pieces were falling into place for what the CIA believed would be another successful covert operation. The plan had the support of the outgoing Eisenhower administration. The CIA was confident in its intelligence and planning, and the exile force was nearing readiness for deployment. But history has a way of complicating even the best-laid plans, and the election would bring new perspectives and new complications to an operation that was already more complex than its planners realized. Chapter 2: The Eisenhower Legacy and CIA Planning. In the final months of the Eisenhower administration, the Cuban operation took on increasing urgency and complexity. President Eisenhower, who had built his reputation on careful strategic planning during World War II, approached the Cuba problem with the methodical mindset of a military commander. He understood that allowing a communist state to establish itself in the Western Hemisphere could fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Cold War. Alan Dulles and his deputy, Richard Bissell, had become the primary architects of what was initially called Operation Pluto. Bissell was particularly well suited for this kind of covert operation. He had successfully managed the development of the U-2 spy plane program, demonstrating his ability to coordinate complex, highly classified projects that required technological innovation and absolute secrecy. The plan that emerged from CIA headquarters in Langley was ambitious and multifaceted. The central concept involved landing a force of approximately 1,500 Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs, a marshy area on Cuba's southern coast. The location was chosen for several strategic reasons. It was relatively isolated, making it less likely that Castro's forces could quickly mobilize a response. It had a small airstrip that could be secured and used to bring in supplies, and it was near the Escambray Mountains, where anti-Castro guerrillas were already operating. The operation would begin with airstrikes designed to destroy Castro's small air force on the ground. This was considered crucial because even a few combat aircraft could pose a serious threat to the invasion force and the ships supporting it. The strikes would be carried out by B-26 bombers, flown by Cuban exile pilots and disguised to look like defections from Castro's air force. Once air superiority was established, the invasion force would land at the Bay of Pigs and establish a beachhead. The CIA expected that news of the invasion would spark a general uprising against Castro throughout Cuba. The exile force would serve as a catalyst, providing a rallying point for Cubans who were dissatisfied with Castro's increasingly authoritarian rule. This assumption of a popular uprising was perhaps the most critical element of the entire plan, and it was based on intelligence that was, at best, optimistic. CIA analysts believed that Castro's support was shallow and that many Cubans were waiting for an opportunity to overthrow his government. This assessment was influenced by reports from Cuban exiles and by the agency's own desire to believe that the operation would succeed. The training of the exile force took place primarily at a secret base in Guatemala, with the full cooperation of that country's government. The recruits, who called themselves Brigade 2506, were put through intensive training in amphibious warfare, guerrilla tactics, and the use of American military equipment. The quality of the recruits varied considerably. Some were experienced military personnel who had served in the Cuban army, while others were students or professionals with no military background. José Pérez San Román, a former Cuban military officer, was chosen to lead Brigade 2506. He was a capable commander who understood the complexity of the operation and the challenges his men would face. However, he also understood that the success of the mission would depend heavily on American support, particularly air cover and naval assistance. The relationship between the CIA and the Cuban exiles was complicated by questions of command and control. The Americans wanted to maintain the fiction that this was a purely Cuban operation, while the exiles understood that their success depended on American support. This tension would create problems throughout the planning and execution phases of the operation. By late 1960, the operation had grown far beyond its original scope. What had begun as a plan to support existing guerrilla groups in Cuba had evolved into a full-scale invasion. The number of exiles involved had increased. The equipment requirements had grown dramatically, and the political stakes had risen accordingly. President Eisenhower was briefed regularly on the operation's progress, but he maintained a careful distance from the operational details. This was partly to maintain plausible deniability, and partly because Eisenhower trusted his intelligence professionals to handle the tactical aspects of the operation. However, Eisenhower did make one crucial decision. He insisted that no American military personnel should be directly involved in the invasion itself. This decision reflected Eisenhower's understanding of the delicate nature of Cold War politics. Direct American military involvement in overthrowing the Cuban government could provoke a dangerous Soviet response, and would certainly damage America's international reputation. The operation had to appear to be a legitimate attempt by Cuban exiles to liberate their homeland. As the Eisenhower administration prepared to leave office, the CIA was confident that the operation was ready to proceed. The exile force was trained and equipped, the airstrikes were planned, and the logistics were in place. Alan Dulles believed that the operation had a good chance of success, and that it would serve as a powerful demonstration of American resolve in the Cold War. However, there were dissenting voices within the government. Some State Department officials worried about the international implications of the operation. The Pentagon had concerns about the military feasibility of the plan, particularly the assumption that a small force could establish and hold a beachhead against Castro's much larger army. These concerns were largely overshadowed by the momentum that had built up behind the operation. Too much had been invested, too many people were involved, and the political pressure to do something about Castro was too great to abandon the plan now. The question was whether the incoming Kennedy administration would share Eisenhower's commitment to the operation, and whether the young president would be willing to take the risks necessary to ensure its success. Chapter 3. New Leadership, Old Problems. Kennedy entered the presidency in January 1961 with the confidence of youth and the burden of immense expectations. At 43, he was the youngest elected president in American history, and he had campaigned on a platform of vigorous leadership and renewed American purpose in the Cold War. The Bay of Pigs operation would be one of his first major tests, and it would shape his presidency in ways he could never have anticipated. Kennedy's introduction to the Cuban operation came during the transition period, in briefings with Allen Dulles and other senior CIA officials. The president-elect was presented with what appeared to be a well-developed plan that had the approval of the outgoing administration and the professional intelligence community. For a new president, particularly one who had criticized the Eisenhower administration for allowing Castro to come to power, the operation seemed to offer an opportunity to demonstrate American resolve and capability. However, Kennedy brought a different perspective to the presidency than his predecessor. Where Eisenhower had been a professional military officer who understood the importance of careful planning and clear command structures, Kennedy was a politician who was acutely aware of the domestic and international implications of presidential decisions. He was also deeply influenced by the intellectual currents of his time, including the writings of military theorists who emphasized the importance of flexible response and counterinsurgency warfare. Kennedy's initial reaction to the Bay of Pigs plan was cautious but not dismissive. He understood the strategic importance of preventing the establishment of a communist state in the Western Hemisphere, and he was aware of the domestic political costs of appearing weak in the face of Soviet expansion. At the same time, he was concerned about the risks of direct American involvement in overthrowing a foreign government. The president assembled a small group of advisors to review the operation. This group included Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, and CIA Director Allen Dulles. The discussions that followed revealed significant disagreements about the wisdom and feasibility of the operation. Dean Rusk, the new Secretary of State, was particularly concerned about the international implications of the operation. He worried that American involvement in overthrowing the Cuban government would damage America's relationships with Latin American countries and provide the Soviet Union with propaganda advantages throughout the developing world. Rusk believed that the operation would be seen as American imperialism, regardless of how carefully it was disguised as a Cuban exile initiative. Robert McNamara, the new Secretary of Defense, approached the operation with the analytical mindset that had made him successful in the business world. He was concerned about the military feasibility of the plan, particularly the assumption that a small force could establish and hold a beachhead against Castro's much larger army. McNamara's questions about logistics, air support, and contingency planning revealed gaps in the CIA's planning that had not been adequately addressed. McGeorge Bundy, Kennedy's national security advisor, was caught between his loyalty to the new president and his respect for the professional intelligence community. Bundy understood the importance of covert operations in the Cold War, but he was also aware of the risks of failure and the potential consequences for the Kennedy administration. Allen Dulles, meanwhile, remained confident in the operation's prospects for success. He argued that the CIA had successfully carried out similar operations in Guatemala and Iran, and that the Cuban operation was based on sound intelligence and careful planning. Dulles believed that the key to success was maintaining secrecy until the last possible moment, and then acting decisively to support the exile force. The debates within the Kennedy administration revealed fundamental disagreements about the nature of the Cold War and America's role in it. Some officials believed that the United States had to be willing to take risks and use covert operations to prevent communist expansion, while others argued that such operations were counterproductive and damaged America's moral authority in the world. Kennedy himself was torn between these competing viewpoints. He understood the political necessity of taking action against Castro, but he was also aware of the risks of failure. The president's decision-making process was complicated by his relative inexperience in foreign policy and his reliance on advisors who often disagreed with each other. As the discussions continued, Kennedy made several modifications to the original plan that would prove to be crucial. Most importantly, he insisted that the operation maintain the appearance of being a purely Cuban exile initiative. This meant that American military personnel could not be directly involved in the invasion, and that the level of American air support would have to be limited. Kennedy also insisted that the landing site be changed from the original plan, which had called for a landing near the city of Trinidad. The president was concerned that a landing near a major population center would make it difficult to maintain the fiction that this was not an American operation. Instead, the landing was moved to the more isolated Bay of Pigs area. These changes, while politically understandable, created significant military problems. The Bay of Pigs landing site was more isolated than Trinidad, but it was also more difficult to defend and farther from the mountains where the exile force could establish guerrilla bases if the initial invasion failed. The reduction in air support also meant that the exile force would be more vulnerable to Castro's air force and ground troops. By March 1961, Kennedy had approved a modified version of the original plan. The president believed that he had reduced the risks of American involvement while maintaining the operation's chances for success. However, the modifications had created new problems that would become apparent only when the operation was actually launched. The tragic irony of the Bay of Pigs operation was that both Kennedy and the CIA were trying to minimize risks, but their risk reduction strategies were incompatible. The CIA wanted maximum American support to ensure the operation's success, while Kennedy wanted minimal American involvement to limit the political costs of failure. The result was a compromise that satisfied neither objective and created the worst possible outcome, an operation that was too large to hide but too small to succeed. Chapter 4. The Invasion. Dawn broke grey and uncertain over the Bay of Pigs on April 17, 1961. The Caribbean waters, usually a brilliant turquoise, seemed muted in the early morning light as the invasion fleet approached the Cuban coast. For the 1,400 men of Brigade 2506, this was the moment they had trained for, dreamed of, and in many cases, prayed for. They were finally going home. The operation had begun 2 days earlier with airstrikes designed to destroy Castro's air force on the ground. B-26 bombers, flown by Cuban exile pilots and painted to look like Cuban Air Force planes, had attacked airfields at Santiago de Cuba, San Antonio de los Baños, and Ciudad Libertad. The attacks had been only partially successful. While some of Castro's planes had been destroyed, others had survived, and Castro himself had been alerted to the impending invasion. The deception surrounding the airstrikes had quickly unraveled. One of the B-26s had flown to Miami, where the pilot claimed to be a defector from Castro's Air Force, who had bombed his own bases before fleeing. However, journalists quickly determined that the plane had never been part of Castro's Air Force, and the cover story collapsed. The international community now knew that the United States was involved in some kind of operation against Cuba. President Kennedy, faced with the exposure of American involvement, made a decision that would prove crucial to the operation's outcome. He cancelled the second wave of airstrikes that were scheduled to begin just before the invasion. This decision was made partly to limit further international embarrassment, and partly because Kennedy believed that the first wave of strikes had been sufficient to neutralize Castro's Air Force. The decision to cancel the airstrikes was communicated to the CIA just hours before they were scheduled to begin. Richard Bissell, the operation's chief planner, was stunned. He understood that the exile force would be extremely vulnerable to air attack, and he had planned the entire operation around the assumption that Castro's Air Force would be destroyed before the invasion began. Bissell immediately called President Kennedy to request that the airstrikes be allowed to proceed. The conversation was brief and tense. Kennedy refused to change his decision, telling Bissell that the political costs of continued airstrikes were too great. The president believed that the exile force could still succeed without the additional air support. Meanwhile, the invasion fleet was approaching the Cuban coast. The force consisted of 5 cargo ships and 2 infantry landing ships, escorted by American destroyers that would remain far enough offshore to maintain the fiction of non-involvement. The ships carried not only the 1,400 members of Brigade 2506, but also their equipment, ammunition and supplies for what was expected to be a prolonged campaign. José Pérez San Román, the brigade commander, was aboard the command ship Houston, reviewing final preparations with his staff. San Román was an experienced military officer who understood the complexity of amphibious operations. He was also acutely aware of how much the success of the mission depended on factors beyond his control, particularly the promised American air support. The landing began at 1:15 a.m., with advance teams going ashore to secure the beaches and clear obstacles. The Bay of Pigs area, known in Spanish as Bahía de Cochinos, was a marshy, sparsely populated region on Cuba's southern coast. The terrain was difficult, with swampy areas inland and coral reefs offshore that made navigation treacherous for the landing craft. Initially, the landing proceeded according to plan. The advance teams encountered only light resistance from local militias, and the main force began coming ashore in the early morning hours. The exiles established beachheads at 2 locations, Playa Girón, Red Beach, and Playa Larga, Blue Beach, about 20 miles apart. However, problems began to emerge almost immediately. The coral reefs offshore proved more extensive than the CIA's intelligence had indicated, and several landing craft were damaged or destroyed while trying to navigate them. Some of the brigade's heavy equipment, including tanks and artillery pieces, was lost in the shallow water. More seriously, Castro's remaining aircraft began attacking the invasion fleet at first light. Despite the initial airstrikes, Castro still had several operational planes, including Sea Fury fighters and T-33 jet trainers that had been converted for ground attack. These aircraft, while not numerous, were effective against the slow-moving cargo ships and landing craft. The freighter Houston was hit by rockets from a Sea Fury and began to sink, taking with it much of the brigade's ammunition and communications equipment. The Rio Escondido, another cargo ship, was also sunk by air attack, along with its cargo of aviation fuel that was desperately needed for the brigade's own air operations. The loss of these ships was a catastrophic blow to the invasion force. Not only had the brigade lost critical supplies, but the surviving ships fled to the safety of international waters, taking with them equipment and personnel that were still needed ashore. The exiles found themselves stranded on the beaches with limited ammunition and no prospect of resupply. On shore, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Castro had mobilized his forces quickly and was rushing troops to the Bay of Pigs area. Unlike the CIA's expectations, there was no popular uprising in support of the invasion. Instead, Castro's government appeared to be maintaining control throughout the country, and the Cuban people seemed to be rallying behind their government in the face of what they saw as foreign aggression. The exile force fought bravely despite their desperate situation. They had superior training and equipment compared to many of Castro's militias, and they fought with the desperation of men who knew they had no retreat. At Playa Larga, the exiles managed to hold off Castro's forces for several hours, inflicting significant casualties on the attacking troops. However, the overwhelming numerical superiority of Castro's forces, combined with their air support and artillery, gradually pushed the exiles back. By the afternoon of April 17th, it was clear that the invasion was failing. The exiles controlled only small pockets of beach. They were running low on ammunition, and they had no way to receive reinforcements or supplies. President Kennedy, monitoring the situation from Washington, was faced with an agonizing decision. The CIA was requesting permission to authorize American airstrikes to support the beleaguered exile force. American naval vessels were standing by offshore, ready to intervene if the president gave the order. The choice was between allowing the operation to fail completely or escalating American involvement to the point where the fiction of non-involvement could no longer be maintained. Kennedy's decision to maintain the limits on American involvement was influenced by several factors. The international community was already aware of American participation in the operation, and direct military intervention would likely provoke a strong Soviet response. The president was also concerned about the domestic political implications of being seen as starting a war over Cuba. As night fell on April 17th, the exile force was in desperate straits. They had been fighting for nearly 20 hours. They were surrounded and outnumbered, and they had no prospect of relief. Many of the men had been wounded, ammunition was running low, and morale was beginning to crack. The tragedy of the Bay of Pigs was not just the failure of a military operation. It was the betrayal of 1,400 brave men who had been led to believe that their mission had the full support of the United States government. These men had risked everything for the chance to liberate their homeland, and they found themselves abandoned on a hostile shore with no way home. The final act of this drama would play out over the next 2 days, as the remnants of Brigade 2506 fought a desperate rearguard action against overwhelming odds, hoping against hope that the cavalry would arrive to save them. Chapter 5: Collapse and Capture. The morning of April 18th brought no relief to the beleaguered members of Brigade 2506. Throughout the night, Castro's forces had tightened their grip around the invasion beaches, bringing up tanks, artillery, and additional infantry. The exile force, now numbering fewer than 1,200 effective fighters, was compressed into an ever-shrinking perimeter with their backs to the sea. José Pérez San Román, still commanding what remained of his brigade, faced an impossible situation. His men were exhausted, running low on ammunition, and had taken heavy casualties. The promised American air support had never materialized, and the supply ships had fled to safety, taking with them any hope of resupply or reinforcement. In Washington, the Kennedy administration was grappling with the political and strategic implications of the invasion's failure. The president had spent much of the night in emergency meetings with his advisors, trying to determine whether there was any way to salvage the operation without committing American forces directly to combat. The CIA continued to press for authorization to use American air power to support the exile force. Richard Bissell argued that a few airstrikes could turn the tide of the battle and allow the exiles to establish a secure beachhead. Alan Dulles supported this position, emphasizing that the United States had a moral obligation to support the men it had trained and equipped for this mission. However, Secretary of State Dean Rusk and other officials argued that direct American military intervention would have catastrophic diplomatic consequences. The Soviet Union would likely respond with military action of its own, possibly in Berlin or other vulnerable locations. The operation had already damaged America's international reputation. Escalating it further would only make things worse. Kennedy found himself caught between these competing pressures. He was deeply troubled by the plight of the exile force, but he was also acutely aware of the broader implications of American military intervention. After hours of agonizing deliberation, the president made a compromise decision that satisfied no one and helped no one. Kennedy authorized a single hour of air cover by unmarked American jets, but only to protect the evacuation of the exile force, not to support continued combat operations. This limited authorization was intended to provide the exiles with an opportunity to escape while minimizing American involvement in offensive operations. The decision came too late and with too many restrictions to be effective. By the time the authorization was communicated to the military commanders, the tactical situation on the ground had deteriorated beyond the point where an hour of air cover could make a meaningful difference. On the beaches of the Bay of Pigs, the final act of the tragedy was playing out. Castro's tanks had broken through the exile perimeter at several points, and organized resistance was beginning to collapse. Small groups of exiles were fighting desperate rearguard actions, trying to buy time for their comrades to escape into the swamps or reach the evacuation beaches. Some members of Brigade 2506 did manage to escape. A few made it to the evacuation point where American ships picked them up under cover of darkness. Others disappeared into the Escambray Mountains, where they would continue guerrilla operations for several more years. However, the vast majority of the invasion force was killed or captured. The capture of the brigade members was particularly tragic because many of them had been led to believe that they would be rescued even if the invasion failed. The CIA had assured the exile leaders that the United States would not abandon them, and many of the fighters believed that American forces would intervene if necessary to prevent their capture. José Pérez San Román was among those captured. The brigade commander had fought to the end, refusing opportunities to escape because he felt responsible for his men. His capture was a particularly bitter blow because he had been one of the most vocal advocates for the operation and had convinced many other Cubans to join the invasion force. The prisoners were taken to various detention facilities throughout Cuba, where they faced interrogation, propaganda sessions, and uncertainty about their fate. Castro's government treated the prisoners as criminals rather than prisoners of war, arguing that they were traitors who had collaborated with a foreign power to invade their own country. The treatment of the prisoners became a major international issue and a continuing source of embarrassment for the Kennedy administration. Families of the captured exiles organized political pressure campaigns, demanding that the American government do more to secure their release. The prisoners themselves became pawns in the broader Cold War struggle between the United States and Cuba. The immediate aftermath of the Bay of Pigs invasion was a period of shock and recrimination in Washington. The Kennedy administration had suffered a major foreign policy defeat just 3 months into the president's term. The failure of the operation had exposed the limitations of covert action and had demonstrated the risks of assuming that other countries would behave as American planners expected them to behave. President Kennedy was particularly affected by the failure of the operation. He had approved the invasion despite his reservations, and he felt personally responsible for the fate of the men who had been killed or captured. The president's sense of guilt was compounded by his awareness that his own decisions, particularly the cancellation of the airstrikes, had contributed to the operation's failure. The Bay of Pigs failure also had important implications for Kennedy's relationship with the CIA and the broader intelligence community. The president had relied heavily on the professional expertise of intelligence officials, but the operation's failure had shown him that this expertise was not infallible. Kennedy would become much more skeptical of CIA assessments and would insist on more rigorous analysis of covert operations. The international implications of the Bay of Pigs invasion were equally significant. The operation had confirmed Soviet and Cuban suspicions about American intentions, and it had provided both countries with justification for closer military cooperation. Castro's government used the invasion as evidence that Cuba needed Soviet protection against American aggression. Perhaps most ominously, the Bay of Pigs invasion had set in motion a chain of events that would lead directly to the Cuban Missile Crisis 18 months later. The failed invasion convinced Castro that he needed stronger defenses against future American attacks, and it persuaded the Soviet Union that Cuba was worth defending. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would bring the world to the brink of nuclear war. Chapter 6. Nuclear Shadows. From Bay of Pigs to Missile Crisis. The failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion reverberated far beyond the beaches of Cuba, sending shockwaves through the corridors of power in Washington, Moscow, and Havana. What had begun as a covert operation to remove a troublesome Caribbean dictator had evolved into something far more dangerous. The catalyst for the most perilous nuclear confrontation in human history. In the immediate aftermath of the invasion, President Kennedy undertook a painful process of self-examination and policy reassessment. The young president, who had entered office with such confidence and vigor, found himself humbled by the reality of Cold War politics. In private conversations with his advisors, Kennedy acknowledged that he had been poorly served by the intelligence community and that he had made critical errors in judgment. How could I have been so stupid? Kennedy reportedly asked his aide Ted Sorensen in the days following the invasion. The president's anguish was not just about the failure of the operation, but about the broader implications for American credibility and his own presidency. Kennedy understood that the Bay of Pigs had made him appear weak and indecisive, particularly in the eyes of Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev indeed drew his own conclusions from the Bay of Pigs failure. The Soviet leader had been testing Kennedy since the beginning of his presidency, trying to determine whether the young American president had the resolve to stand up to Soviet pressure. The Bay of Pigs suggested that Kennedy might be willing to authorize aggressive action, but lacked the courage to see it through to completion. This assessment would influence Khrushchev's behavior over the next 18 months, leading him to become increasingly bold in his challenges to American power. The Soviet leader believed that Kennedy could be intimidated and that the United States might not respond decisively to Soviet provocations. Meanwhile, in Havana, Fidel Castro was drawing his own lessons from the invasion. The Cuban leader had survived the most serious challenge to his rule, but he understood that the United States would likely try again. Castro became convinced that he needed stronger defenses and more reliable allies if he was going to survive future American attempts to overthrow his government. Castro's concerns were well-founded. The Kennedy administration did not abandon its efforts to remove the Cuban leader after the Bay of Pigs failure. Instead, the president authorized a massive covert program called Operation Mongoose, designed to destabilize Castro's government through sabotage, economic warfare, and support for internal opposition groups. Operation Mongoose was far more extensive than the Bay of Pigs invasion had been. It involved hundreds of CIA operatives, millions of dollars in funding, and a wide range of activities designed to make Castro's Cuba ungovernable. The operation included plans to sabotage sugar mills, oil refineries, and transportation infrastructure. There were also numerous assassination plots against Castro himself, ranging from poisoned cigars to exploding seashells. The existence of Operation Mongoose was not known to the general public, but it was well known to Castro's intelligence services and to the Soviet Union. The ongoing American campaign against Cuba provided both countries with compelling evidence that the United States was determined to overthrow Castro's government by any means necessary. This evidence became crucial in the summer of 1962, when Khrushchev made the fateful decision to deploy nuclear missiles to Cuba. The Soviet leader later claimed that his primary motivation was to defend Cuba against American attack, and the Bay of Pigs invasion and Operation Mongoose provided powerful justification for this argument. However, Khrushchev's motivations were more complex than simple solidarity with Cuba. The Soviet leader was also concerned about the nuclear balance of power, which heavily favored the United States. American missiles in Turkey and Italy could strike targets throughout the Soviet Union, while Soviet missiles could only reach American territory from Soviet soil. Placing missiles in Cuba would give the Soviet Union the ability to threaten American cities and military installations from close range. The decision to deploy missiles to Cuba was made in the spring of 1962, more than a year after the Bay of Pigs invasion. The timing was not coincidental. Khrushchev had concluded that Kennedy was both aggressive enough to authorize attacks on Cuba and weak enough to be deterred by the threat of nuclear retaliation. The Soviet decision-making process was remarkably secretive, even by Cold War standards. Only a handful of top Soviet officials were involved in the initial discussions, and the decision was made without consulting Cuba's leadership. Castro was informed of the Soviet decision only after it had been made, though he enthusiastically agreed to accept the missiles. For Castro, the Soviet offer represented the ultimate security guarantee. Nuclear missiles on Cuban soil would make it virtually impossible for the United States to launch another invasion like the Bay of Pigs. The Cuban leader understood that the missiles would make his island a potential nuclear battlefield, but he calculated that the deterrent effect would be worth the risk. The installation of the missiles began in the summer of 1962, carried out under extraordinary secrecy. Soviet ships transported the missiles and supporting equipment to Cuba in carefully orchestrated convoys. The missiles themselves were medium-range ballistic missiles capable of striking targets throughout the eastern United States, including Washington, D.C. The Kennedy administration remained unaware of the missile deployment for several months. American intelligence agencies were monitoring Soviet activities in Cuba, but the scale and secrecy of the operation made it difficult to determine exactly what was happening. When American reconnaissance flights finally detected the missile sites in October 1962, the discovery triggered the most dangerous crisis of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis, as it came to be known, brought the world closer to nuclear war than it had ever been before or since. For 13 days in October 1962, the United States and Soviet Union engaged in a tense diplomatic and military standoff that could have resulted in the destruction of both countries and much of the world. President Kennedy, who had been so deeply affected by the Bay of Pigs failure, approached the missile crisis with a very different mindset. He was determined not to repeat the mistakes that had led to the earlier disaster. Kennedy assembled a carefully selected group of advisors, known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, ExComm, to help him manage the crisis. The discussions within ExComm revealed how much Kennedy had learned from the Bay of Pigs experience. The president insisted on rigorous analysis of all options, demanded detailed contingency planning, and refused to accept the CIA's assessments without independent verification. Kennedy had been burned by trusting the intelligence community too completely during the Bay of Pigs, and he was determined not to make the same mistake again. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis required exactly the kind of careful diplomacy and strategic thinking that had been absent from the Bay of Pigs planning. Kennedy and Khrushchev engaged in a complex negotiation that involved public statements, private communications, and back-channel diplomacy. The final agreement required the Soviet Union to remove its missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American pledge not to invade Cuba, and the secret removal of American missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended peacefully, but its resolution highlighted how directly it was connected to the Bay of Pigs invasion. The American pledge not to invade Cuba was essentially an acknowledgement that the Bay of Pigs had been a mistake, and that the United States would not repeat it. Castro had achieved through the missile crisis what he had been seeking since the Bay of Pigs, a credible guarantee that the United States would not try to overthrow his government by force. The nuclear dimension of the crisis also demonstrated how a relatively small conflict could escalate into a global catastrophe. The Bay of Pigs invasion had involved fewer than 1,500 men and had lasted only 3 days. Yet it had set in motion a chain of events that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war just 18 months later. The connection between the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis illustrates one of the most important lessons of Cold War history, that seemingly local conflicts could have global implications, and that failed operations could have consequences far beyond their immediate objectives. Kennedy's decision to limit American involvement in the Bay of Pigs invasion was intended to prevent escalation, but it actually contributed to a much more dangerous crisis later. The irony of this sequence of events was not lost on Kennedy himself. The president, who had been criticized for being weak during the Bay of Pigs, was praised for his restraint and wisdom during the missile crisis. Kennedy had learned from his earlier mistakes and had applied those lessons when the stakes were much higher. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis marked a turning point in the Cold War. Both the United States and Soviet Union had looked into the nuclear abyss and had decided to step back. The crisis led to improved communication between the superpowers, including the establishment of the hotline between Washington and Moscow, and to the first nuclear arms control agreements. However, the crisis also left Cuba in a unique position in the Cold War. Castro's government had survived both the Bay of Pigs invasion and the missile crisis, and it had secured Soviet protection against future American attacks. Cuba would remain a communist state throughout the Cold War and beyond, a testament to the unintended consequences of the failed invasion that had been intended to remove Castro from power. As we reach the end of our journey through these pivotal days of April 1961 and their far-reaching consequences, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on the profound lessons embedded in this story. The Bay of Pigs invasion was, by any measure, a failure, but it was a failure that taught the world, and particularly its leaders, essential truths about the nature of power, responsibility, and the delicate art of international relations. Perhaps the most striking aspect of this entire saga is how a relatively small operation, 1,400 men landing on a remote beach, could set in motion events that would bring the world to the very edge of nuclear destruction. This reminds us that in our interconnected world, no action exists in isolation. Every decision, every policy, every military operation sends ripples across the global pond, often in ways that its architects never intended or imagined. President Kennedy's evolution from the Bay of Pigs to the Cuban Missile Crisis represents one of the most remarkable examples of learning under pressure in modern political history. The young president, who had been overwhelmed by competing advice and uncertain intelligence in April 1961, became the careful, methodical leader who navigated the world through its most dangerous nuclear crisis in October 1962. Kennedy himself reflected on this transformation in later interviews. He spoke about how the Bay of Pigs had taught him to question everything, to demand multiple perspectives, and never to accept assurances from any single source, no matter how authoritative they might seem. "The first advice I'm going to give my successor," Kennedy reportedly said, "is to watch the generals and to avoid feeling that because they were military men, their opinions on military matters were worth a damn." The human cost of the Bay of Pigs invasion should never be forgotten in our analysis of its political and strategic implications. 114 members of Brigade 2506 died on those beaches, and more than 1,100 were captured and imprisoned. These were not abstract strategic assets. They were husbands, fathers, sons and brothers who believed they were fighting for their homeland's freedom. Their sacrifice reminds us that behind every policy decision and strategic calculation are real people whose lives hang in the balance. The surviving members of Brigade 2506 would eventually be ransomed back to the United States in December 1962, in exchange for medical supplies and baby food worth $53 million. Kennedy welcomed them at a ceremony in Miami, where he accepted the brigade's flag and promised that it would one day fly over a free Cuba. It was a promise that would never be fulfilled, but it reflected Kennedy's genuine sense of responsibility for the men who had suffered because of his decisions. For Fidel Castro, the Bay of Pigs invasion became a defining moment that shaped the rest of his long political career. The failed invasion provided him with a powerful narrative of resistance against American imperialism, a narrative that helped legitimize his increasingly authoritarian rule. Castro would govern Cuba for nearly 5 more decades, outlasting 10 American presidents and becoming one of the longest-serving leaders in modern history. The Soviet Union, too, drew lasting lessons from the Bay of Pigs and its aftermath. Khrushchev's initial assessment of Kennedy as weak and indecisive would prove to be dangerously wrong, but it influenced Soviet policy for years to come. The missile crisis that grew out of the Bay of Pigs failure ultimately led to a more stable relationship between the superpowers, based on mutual recognition of the need to avoid nuclear confrontation. The CIA underwent significant changes in the wake of the Bay of Pigs failure. Alan Dulles, who had led the agency since its creation, was forced to resign. The agency's procedures for covert operations were completely overhauled, with new requirements for rigorous analysis and presidential oversight. The days when the CIA could launch major operations with minimal political supervision were over. Perhaps most importantly, the Bay of Pigs invasion demonstrated the limits of American power and the dangers of assuming that other peoples would welcome American intervention. The CIA's assumption that Cubans would rise up against Castro was based on wishful thinking rather than solid intelligence. This lesson would be forgotten and relearned many times over the succeeding decades in places like Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The story of the Bay of Pigs also illustrates the importance of understanding the perspectives and motivations of other countries and leaders. American policymakers consistently underestimated Castro's political skills, his genuine popularity among many Cubans, and his ability to survive external pressure. They also failed to anticipate how the invasion would affect Soviet calculations about Cuba's strategic value. As we consider these events from the perspective of more than 6 decades later, we can see how they fit into the broader pattern of Cold War history. The Bay of Pigs was neither the first nor the last time that the superpowers would come dangerously close to direct confrontation. But it was perhaps the most instructive, because it showed how quickly local conflicts could escalate into global crises, and how the decisions of a few individuals could affect the fate of millions. The beaches of the Bay of Pigs are quiet now. The coral reefs that damaged so many landing craft still guard the shore, and the swamps where some members of Brigade 2506 tried to escape are largely unchanged. But the lessons of those 3 days in April 1961 continue to resonate, reminding us of the weight of leadership, the complexity of international relations, and the precious fragility of peace. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll carry with you not just the story of this failed invasion, but the deeper truths it reveals about human nature, political power, and the eternal struggle between nations and ideologies. History, after all, is not just about what happened in the past. It's about understanding the forces that continue to shape our world today. The Bay of Pigs reminds us that even in our modern age of precision weapons and instant communication, the fog of war remains as thick as ever, and the unintended consequences of well-intentioned actions can echo through history for generations to come. Rest well, knowing that the leaders who came after Kennedy and Khrushchev learned from their example, and that the world, though still dangerous, has managed to step back from the nuclear brink that seemed so terrifyingly close in those April days of 1961. That concludes tonight's video. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most consequential episodes of the Cold War. Sleep peacefully, and remember that even in our darkest historical moments, human wisdom and restraint have ultimately prevailed. Until next time, good night.